3 more speakers here in the session, and of course there will be questions to you, Sarita, but we agreed that we'll pool all questions to the last part of the session here. So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Fernanda Beichel, sociologist and PhD in political and social science, principal researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research, CONICET, in Argentina, head professor of Latin American sociology at the National University of Cuyo. Fernanda has received a number of awards, and she is going to talk to us under the heading The Latin American Publishing Circuit, Struggling for Recognition in Between the Mainstream and the Local. Please.
Thank you. This is fine, right? Yes. Thank you to ASPAN and the organizing committee, Bernie, Lars, of course, and Abel Packer, who specially invited me here. I'm not a publisher, and I'm a researcher on sociology of science and Latin American sociology, and particularly my specialty is evaluative cultures. So taking some of the issues that were discussed before, I will try to argue at the end of this talk that really what we have to do is to change evaluative cultures. But I would like to start with remembering one thing that in the 1990s was, at least for Latin America, a very extended belief, and which is the term globalization. If you all remember, in the 1990s, the globalization was some kind of a fever, and everybody in Latin America thought that the nation states have been erased forever. But very soon we realized that these nation states were only ours that had disappeared with the neoliberal governments, while the central countries kept on developing their protectionist policies. I think that with global science, something similar happened here. I mean, in the 1950s and 60s, the Institute for Scientific Information and the Web of Science created a database with thousands of journals that were believed to be the global, the universal science, the universal journals, which were supposed to be evaluated as the more interesting, more important, more relevant type of knowledge production in the world. And that was accompanied, that's not an English word, that came with a lot of indicators of universal science that were supposed to be precisely the way that we could prove that the peripheral science was very little, very scarce, or very undeveloped. And I think that's one of my criticisms to the name of this panel, because it says in the developing countries. And I think that in Latin America, at least, I don't know what my colleagues will say, but we have a very well-developed science. The problem is it's not really visible. So what I think is that this Web of Science, for so many years, monopoly on these indicators and the construction of what we can call the mainstream circuit, really became a circuit of recognition. And so what I'm presenting here, I hope you can read here, is basically to say that we do have a mainstream circuit that is completely convinced everybody, not only Web of Science, of course, Scopus now also, that in the evaluations of a researcher in an institution, what you will really, the way you can really assure a reward in tenure and promotion is to publish in high-impact journals. And this is, unfortunately, very true in our institutions. And so the recognition of this circuit has been very, very, very extended. And coming back to the globalization fever in Latin America, soon we realized that that was also not precisely global science, because in this first database, or the Science Citation Index, the journals were mainly American journals in English, and the subscription was so high that most of our institutions didn't even have access to read what they produced, even if they published there. And so finally, our journals were not indexed in these type of repositories or databases, and what was supposed to be world science became for us world science. I mean, like a Berlin Wall, a really round Berlin Wall. But in Latin America, and I believe in the rest of the South, but especially in Latin America, we had a very important and very long-lasting regional circuit that was publishing circuit that had been working for many, many years. As an intellectual space, it's already 200 years as a regional intellectual space. This is the basis of the circuit, and I'm going to try to say a few words about that. But what I finally say on this idea of the globalization fever is that we realized that from Latin America, we were in front of a very, very closed type of, even endogamous type of circuit. Now, the question is, did Latin America create an open access environment, but also a circuit of recognition? Because this is the most important thing. If a publishing circuit is very successful in many ways as a communication circuit, etc., but it does not generate recognition for the scholars, well, we're not going to lead anywhere. And so I will try to say a few words on this regional circuit. Just to say, in this scheme, you can see that the national field, I can imagine Argentina, the national field is still really composed of one or maybe two evaluative cultures, it depends on the country, that depend on the national policies and the scientific type of rewards of the institutions, but it is crossed by many circuits, publishing circuits. Well, the question is the regional, the Latin American circuit, a circuit of recognition? I don't have much time, so I will just tell you that this regional circuit has at least three phases. The first one starts in the end of the 18th century, and I'm talking there about a Latin American intellectual space, which was reinforced by independence and by our intellectuals and military intellectuals of the independence in the whole 19th century. In the 1920s, this intellectual circuit had a very, very important publishing network, mainly based on the cultural journals. In the 1950s, this changed completely, and we have the second phase, which is when the publishing circuit really started to develop, along with an academic circuit that was really regional and it was really dynamical, and was composed mainly of regional centers like the Economic Commission for Latin America, the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, and maybe some of you have heard of the CLACSO, the Latin American Council for Social Sciences. It was not only an academic circuit composed of social sciences, you also had regional centers for math, for astronomy, for biology, for agrarian sciences, and many journals that were regional and were supposed to communicate the region. Now, the question is, compared to Europe, I will say a few words in a minute, but the question that we should ask here now is, when does this circuit become a publishing circuit linked to the open access? And that's the third phase that you see there. In between the second and the third, in the 1970s, you have the creation of the first meetings of the librarians, of the connection between the librarians that wanted to generate databases for the region, and after, especially CLACSO worked in that direction, and the first indexing systems of our region, such as Clase and Periódica. That was 1973, for example. But in the 1990s, this circuit became a circuit that dedicated all the journals that were dedicated to create an open access environment. And that's when in the 1990s we have Latindex, created Latindex and Cielo and Redalic that you may know. These are three important relevant indexation systems. So now that we have this most recent phase in which the regional circuit is consolidated as an open access environment, my question is, what happened with this public open access circuit when the mainstream circuit became really a universal type of global recognition? And you know, that happened when our own institutions started to believe in Web of Science and in these high impact journals as the way to really get recognition in between us in the periphery. And at that moment, which could be today, these regional repositories and the regional circuit itself is completely dominated in front of the high-impact type of journals as Web of Science or Scopus, and completely dominating, especially in Spanish and Portuguese type of journals, and dominating especially relating to thousands of journals that are still not indexed, and that they are scientific journals created by our universities, dedicated to the local needs of the communities that are around the universities. We have a very extended tradition, a very long tradition of extension, university extension, and most of these universities that are related to the local communities and that have projects to really satisfy these local needs have journals that are not indexed, that are not even in the Latin American regional circuit, but they really are thinking on solving local needs. So if we put on the table the discussion on relevance, I think these are very relevant journals, right? So this regional circuit has some tensions now, because in the effort to conquer high quality against excellence of the high impact, it is very, very difficult to get journals indexed in our regional repositories. And so of the 10,000 journals that we have in Latin America, I mean active journals in our database that we have made a survey, we have 4,500 that are not indexed. And so we have an internal tension to solve, but we have a global tension to solve. And the most important tension, now is to find a way to create regional indicators of circulation. I mean, if you go to any scientific report, a world scientific report, the Latin American production is only searched within these mainstream databases. Why? Because if I search for Latin American production on Cielo, I will find in its 2,000 journals a lot of production coming from my last name, for example. But if I want to go to Redalic, I have to do it separately. And if I want to go to Latindex, it's not even possible at the moment. So what we're trying to do, and this is just a project I wanted to present to you in our research team, and in collaboration with Amelica and a regional initiative that has been created with Claxo and UNESCO, is to create a regional database to have indicators of production in terms of, in the level of the article. And so finally, what I would, I think I'm on time. Yes, I'm fine, okay. And so finally, what I would like to say is that if we have these relevant local circuits with let's say local journals, they could be digital and they could have a very broad audience, but they are not indexed, and so they don't have such a universal agenda, and maybe they're not in the research front of the great discussion in the high impact journals, but they do solve local needs, and we need to think as a region on all these journals, right, and to think on relevance for all the journals. And in the second place, we need to boost this regional circulation to create indicators that can help us to change evaluative cultures, because in the institutions, when I don't know if you participate in assessing in evaluations, but that's my expertise, and I work in national committees, and normally the only way to find the impact, or to decide on tenure and promotion, is to find the last name in Scopus and H-index. And we don't have that for the regional circuit. And so the first thing we need to do is to create a database that could show this production that is not visible in the mainstream databases. Now, in the end of November, we have a regional forum at Mexico organized precisely to find the way to create recommendations for the institutions on evaluative cultures in order to rethink how to rank these type of indexations. So the normal thing is to find Web of Science or Scopus in first place. In second place, Cielo, Redalic, or Latindex in most of our countries. Argentina is an exception in that case. And we are working on that forum on the idea to generate a regional recommendation for the rank of for new ranking of these indexations. And finally, I would just leave a question here or something that came to me after the first panel. I mean, now that open access is a global concern, I mean, we would be living like a open access fever now. And so this is now a global concern, but precisely or exactly it is a northern concern of these countries from Europe here and the United States. And so shouldn't we think on an articulation of the initiatives that are coming from Europe and the North with the Latin American open access circuit that exists at least since the beginning of the 1990s and don't have fees and don't have any other funds than the public funds for their existence? And the second, more than a question, is a concern. If open access is generalized, but transferring the cost to the authors, my question is, isn't this harming an open access environment as Latin American environment, which could be the harm for us? And I think that it should be a global concern, the existence and the survivance of the Latin American circuit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernanda, again for a very interesting presentation. I loved the bit about the history of the developments here, and yeah. Okay, we are moving to our next panelist, which is Robin Crew. He's a senior research fellow, Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. He's the chair of the Standing Committee on Scholarly Publishing in South Africa, of the Academy of Science of South Africa. The committee oversees the scholarly publishing program of the Academy, which includes the National Scholarly Editors Forum. Yeah, Robin will talk about the evolving ecosystem of scholarly publishing in South Africa and its confrontation with the emerging realities. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you this afternoon. I must say, as with the two previous speakers, I was coerced into this by Abel Packer. And I think it relates to the interactions that we've had with Brazil over the development of open access journals. And I thought that it might be useful this afternoon to speak very briefly about an ecosystem of publishing in a particular country and some of the important issues that arise out of exploring that. I think that it's also important to give you an indication of the commitments to open access publishing that are, have been made in South Africa and some other African countries. First of all, the Academy has produced 2 reports on scholarly publishing. The first was in 2006, which is almost a decade ago, or more than a decade ago. And in that scholarly report, it indicated that the move towards open access publishing was a very important move, and a very important move for a country with a relatively small scientific base. And that scientific base can actually achieve a greater impact globally if the publications are open access rather than hidden away behind paywalls. They also produced a second report earlier this year, and again advocated open access and also advocated the establishment of mechanisms of implementation within the country. Now, the implementation, of course, takes place within the context of institutions and funding. The previous panel to this one discussed to some extent the issues of funding, and those are very important in looking at the way in which the system is going to work. The second institution listed on this slide is the National Research Foundation. It's the main research funder in South Africa, and it last year produced a statement on open access for research publications, and the requirement now is that if you receive funding from them, the publications have to be in an open access journal, and also that the data has to be in open access repositories of some kind. The government of South Africa established what they called the African Open Science Platform, and they released a concept document in December 2019. And of course, this is an open science platform. It's not just open access. It's a whole range of interacting activities that contribute to open science. And then finally, the African Academy of Science, which is the continent-wide academy, has launched what they call the African Academy of Science Open Science Initiative, and they've registered support for Plan S, as we were discussing earlier today. I'm not really sure whether people understand the implications of that endorsement, but I'll come to that in a moment. I think I should also give you a very brief idea about the funding landscape, because the funding landscape is what makes open access publications feasible. The Department of Higher Education funds the universities on the basis of the research publications that they produce. And so they get a component of their research funding based on their previous performance. And the performance is research publications which are in accredited journals. And I'll come on to that in a moment. In addition to that, the higher education institutions receive funding from the Department of Higher Education to fund their library acquisitions. And that funding is essentially going to the major commercial publishers. And that's the area where there is significant tension and contention about the amount of fund that's being transferred to these international publishers. And so those are two main streams of publication. The National Research Foundation provides funding for research activities, and it encourages open access research publications and the archiving of results. But until recently, it precluded using any of that money for publications. And I think that's one of the major deficiencies of their particular system of funding. And then in relation to researchers who work in South Africa, many of them are recipients of funding from the Wellcome Trust, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, various forms of European Union funding, United States foundations, and so on. Now, a number of those organizations are signatories to Plan S. So Plan S is going to have an immediate impact on some of the local researchers, and I don't think that currently they fully understand what the implications of that may be in terms of their preferred means of publication, which may no longer be available to them. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you is that the Academy of Science has been involved in the implementation of open access activities within the country. First of all, in collaboration with Cielo Brazil, the Academy started Cielo South Africa. And essentially what it did is it established a searchable full-text database service for South African-based scholarly journals. And this has had a significant impact on the global visibility of the work that's actually been undertaken in South Africa. And more recently, this particular database has become indexed in the world of science. The Web of Science, sorry.
No.
So if you search the Web of Science, you will certainly find the information there. So I think that's been a very significant development. The database currently has 76 different journals on its database, and it's aiming to move towards a total of roughly somewhere around about 180 journals. In addition to that development, the Academy developed the National Scholarly Editors Forum, which was a forum of editors of all the South African journals. And essentially the idea for creating that forum was to allow the editors of the journals to, first of all, establish codes of conduct about the way in which the journals should be operated, but also served as a platform for moving them in the direction of open access, and also moving the government institutions in the direction of making policies that were friendly to the establishment of these open access journals. We also established the National Scholarly Book Publishers Forum. We spoke mostly about journals here, but the question of open access book publication is also an issue that needs to be discussed in somewhat greater depth. And so that forum is currently looking at ways of publishing books and also influencing policy in relation to the funding of books rather than just the funding of journals. And then I think one of the more interesting innovations that the Academy produced was a journal peer review mechanism. Now, normally we think about journals exercising peer review over their authors, but the Academy decided to exercise peer review over the journals. And this turned out to be a very interesting process, because what the Academy did was a systematic peer review of all the journals, almost all the journals that are published in South Africa, in order to give the journals advice about the way in which they were operating and how they were viewed as scholarly journals. And I think that this has had a very important impact on the development of the journals and the development of the quality of the journals. And currently, the journals need to be recognized via this peer review mechanism in order to receive funding from the Department of Higher Education. Then I would like to just talk very briefly about some of the entities in the scholarly journal publishing landscape, because these are the entities that are going to be significantly affected by the move to open access publication. The first of these entities is the organization that negotiates with the major commercial publishers in order to get agreements about what South African institutions will pay for their subscriptions. And I think the way in which we view this is that we hope that as we transition from the current system to open access, this particular institution will no longer have a function, because we won't have to do that any longer. But I suspect that's wishful thinking at the moment. The second service is one which provides library services on a large scale for many of the journals that are made available to the libraries. And obviously that institution is going to have to rethink the future of its business model and the way it will operate in a different environment. The final two entities in the journal landscape are both open access journal publishers. And I think for them, the comment that was made earlier that the open access journal publishers are being left out of this conversation as one of the major issues that we and they will need to confront going into the future, because their existence is very largely dependent on the funding that comes from government sources for research outputs. And then very briefly, in relation to scholarly book publishing, we have 3 university-based presses, and those university-based presses, like the Stanford University Press, are under some stress because their institutions think that they should operate in a commercial environment, and they're having great difficulties in doing that. And I think that is where the issue of the way in which funding for publications takes place, particularly in the humanities, needs to be reviewed. The last example, which is the HSRC press, is an example of a science council that runs a press, and science councils in South Africa are funded by government. And so there isn't the same pressure for them to be, shall we say, commercially viable. The entities in the journal publishing landscape are the Academy of Science, which publishes the South African Journal of Science, which is open access, it's free to read, and it's free to publish. So it's what's called diamond open access. Then the Academy also runs an open journal platform with 7 journals on it, all of them open access. But our big issue is in relation to the learned society journals. And as was mentioned earlier in the previous panel, there are something like 250 titles, not nearly as many as in South America, but there are 250 titles. Most of them are subscription-based, and they need significant help in making the transition to open access and to developing a future strategy for the survival of those journals. And then I just before this conference started, I got some data from an analysis that was done by a group in the Netherlands on the performance of open access publishing. And this gives you some of the results. What the group in the Netherlands did was they analyzed 930 universities globally and looked at the degree to which those universities had embraced open access publishing. And on the top 2 graphs there, you see the publications that are in gold open access of the various countries that are ranked, and the arrow indicates South Africa. The bottom 2 sets of journals, the top one is all of the open access publications. The bottom 2 figures are the gold open access publications, and if you look at the panel on the bottom right, you'll see the 2 countries that at the top of the gold open access publications are Brazil and South Africa. And I think that it's not unrelated to the fact that Cielo was established by Brazil and escaped and transferred to the South African one. And the result of that you can see here in terms of the way in which those countries and their institutions are moving towards open access publications. And then I couldn't resist the temptation to show you this final slide, which is the performance of the University of Pretoria in relation to the 930 institutions. And that's the top level of the ranking. And what that boils down to is that the university has a policy to ensure that every publication that is produced by a reporter, by an author in the institution has to be archived in their repository. And I think that's why you see the results that you do see. It has nothing to do with performance appraisal and everything to do with the actual publications. So if I could finish off with a number of conclusions then, I think that South African institutions generally are committed to open access. Open science, which is one component of open access, is the policy of the government and its funding agencies. And there's a transition from the current system of publication to open access, but that transition is very poorly defined. And the relationship with many of the commercial publishers are completely unresolved. Funding for the production of open access scholarly books is, as I said, under discussion, and that's a major issue for development. And some of the components, such as the open access publishers, you can regard as being open access ready, but other components of this ecosystem actually face very major challenges in their business models. And our feeling is there's a need to undertake a thorough review of this landscape, the whole landscape, and its potential funding sources to ensure that scholarly publishing remains valuable for individuals and for those institutions. I think the focus has to be on the scholarly publishing activities themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robin, for a reasonably optimistic view of the developments in a sort of complex landscape, I could say. Okay, moving on to the final speaker in this session. I will introduce Shahid Jameel, who has been Chief Executive Officer at the Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance since 2013. Shahid has been doing research for many years in human viruses. Shahid is a fellow of the All Science Academies of India and has been active in a lot of things related to science policy and administration. And Shahid will inform us about the open access environment in India. Please.
Thank you, Lars. And thank you for inviting me to this meeting. The disadvantage of speaking in the end is that everything useful has been said. Nevertheless, Indians, as you may know, are fascinated with numbers, are quantitative, so I'll show you a lot of numbers, and hopefully, hidden in those numbers, you will see a trend, and you will see that I agree with what my colleagues here have said earlier. So let me first take you to India's higher education and research landscape. We have about 700 universities, and almost all the universities have faculties of science, including life sciences. That's my core area of expertise. We have 20 Indian institutes of technology, which are engineering schools, high-end engineering schools. A total of about 40,000 undergraduate students go to these schools. And the selection criteria for getting into an IIT is very, very tough. Maybe 1 in 2,000 or so make it to these IITs. And recently, we've set up 8 Indian institutes for science education and research, which are similar to IITs, but they're not technology-oriented, they're more science-oriented. We have about 7,000 research and development institutes in the country. The faculty size varies between 30 to 50 in each of these, and each of these train anywhere from about 50 to 200 PhD students at any given time. So that's very broadly the landscape we're talking about. Now, in terms of the research and development budgets and the expenditure, in 17-18, India spent 1 trillion Indian rupees, which is equivalent of roughly $14 billion based on the rate prevalent yesterday. And if you look at the R&D expenditure by select agencies, what I show here is various agencies fund research. You will notice that the highest budgets go to the Defense Research Development Organization, which gives very little money outside the defense sector. The Department of Space, these are the guys who put the lunar vehicle on the moon. The Department of Atomic Energy, which funds all the research that made India a nuclear state. The Indian Council of Agricultural Research, which funds research in agriculture. And then come the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, Department of Science and Technology, Department of Biotechnology, and Indian Council of Medical Research. If you look at the graph on the bottom, you will see that the highest extramural funding is given by the funding agencies that receive the least amount of money. Okay, so that's DST, DBT, ICMR. So there is an imbalance here, even within our own research ecosystem as far as funding independent scientists is concerned. Now, when we start looking at the R&D investment, publications, and open access, you will see that in 17-18, the national R&D investment, as I said earlier, was about $14 billion. In 2017, Indian researchers produced 140,000 peer-reviewed articles on Scopus. There are probably more, definitely many more, but these are on Scopus. Only 27,000 of these, which is 19% of these, were available to the public freely to read and share. So there is this imbalance, and this does disservice to the scientific ecosystem and public interest. And I say that because if you look at the schematic on the left, this shows that in India, about 50%, in fact, 52% of the investment in R&D comes from government sources. It comes from the taxpayer. So it's the public which is paying for the science, yet the public does not have access to that science if only 20% or so publications are open access. What are the reasons for these poor open access practices? And this is a report that I quote from the Delhi Law University, which is the Open Science India report, and this is openly accessible. About 40% people were not willing to pay the publisher an article processing fee. About 30% did not have the money to fund an APC. And so essentially, it's about the funding that a researcher has and whether they're able to afford the open access charges. There's also reasons for poor open data practices. So open access is not just about publications, it's also about data. And the main causes are really personal causes. People don't want to share information openly. But about 15% people were discouraged from sharing data by the absence of institutional mandates, and about 11% did not share because there was no funding agency mandate. So sharing of open data is about having mandates or not. Whereas making publications open access has to do with people not having the required funds to do that. I've just cataloged this, the policies prevalent in the country, and I'm not going to go through this in detail. The columns represent the main funding agencies that provide extramural support. So that's Department of Biotechnology and Department of Science and Technology, the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, and the Indian Council of Agricultural Research. The important thing is that all of them require people to put their accepted manuscripts before they are formatted by the journals in institutional repositories. And beyond that, if we go to the compliance, or the last part of the point number 8, people are asked to deposit the IDs in their annual reports, as well as when core facilities have to renew their funding. However, I must say that the compliance is very, very poor, simply because the funding agencies that have these mandates are not actually paying attention to whether people are depositing things in institutional repositories or not. Where do we come in? So I work for India Alliance, which is registered as a public charity in India. And currently we are funded by the Wellcome Trust and by the Department of Biotechnology, or DBT, Government of India. We became the first funder in India to mandate open access for publications, invited reviews, metadata, and supplementary information. For the first 10 years of our existence, we followed a gold open access model, but we recently shifted this slightly. We now encourage our fellows to submit accepted manuscripts to institutional repositories as per the DBT DST policy in the country. We also tell our fellows that we prefer green open access, but we will make payments and make it gold access, open access, if there is a greater than 6-month embargo by the publisher. APCs in open access journals in our system is considered as publication costs, which have to be covered from the grants. And for people who have finished our fellowship but are still publishing from it, we cover both the APC and the open access charges, of course, if they are beyond the 6-month embargo period. And we also encourage people to put preprints in international repositories such as bioRxiv, and these are considered both by funding committees as well as evaluation committees to be equivalent to publications at the time of assessment. Why did we make this shift? We made this shift because of the increasing costs that we were incurring. So if you look at this graph, between 2012 and 2018, we spent roughly 0.4 million euros on just paying gold open access charges. Just in 2018-19, we spent $180,000 on supporting gold open access for our fellows. So this exponential rise in costs is something that required us to move from a fully gold open access model into a slightly lesser compliant model. If you look at India's overall situation with respect to APCs and journal subscriptions, we feel that this is an example of double charging. During 2010 to 14, Indian researchers used 488 open access journals with a range of fees, and the total outlay was about $2.4 million. During 2018, just 1 year, India spent an estimated $200+ million for subscription to online and print journals. So at one end, we are paying for subscription, and at the other end, we are paying open access charges to those same journals. Just in the 4 years, 2016 to 19, 2 open access journals, PLOS ONE and Scientific Reports, Indian researchers spent $5.4 million on open access, or rather APCs, to these journals. And an estimated $4 to $7 million were spent on Scopus and Web of Science databases. So you see the money is going out essentially from the same source to supporting open access research, yet the research is being limited at the other end, and that seems to be a problem. What is Government of India's position on this? And I show you the quote from Professor Vijayaraghavan, who's the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India. He's the country's chief scientist, essentially. And on the right, I show you some tweets that he made. And essentially what he's saying is that the current system is very unfair. And India will negotiate for fees that are normalized to India. Now, what that fees would be is something for the government to decide. But I can tell you that all the 3 science academies of India have just produced a report. I'm sure the government is going to take a very hard look at this report, which makes recommendations as to how the government should be going forward. And they fully support these institutional repositories and negotiating fair open access agreements with publishers. What about Plan S? First, consider these figures. The estimated payments to open access journals from India has been about 2 million euros per year in the period of 2010 to 14. The Plan S cost for India would jump to about 78 or 80 million euros per year. This is about half the budget of Department of Biotechnology and Indian Council of Medical Research put together. And that's clearly going to be a problem. What Plan S does is to transfer the payment from researchers to government or to the taxpayers. And this, mind you, is to cover profits for private vendors, which is a serious issue. Who would pay these bills? And if the government is going to pay for these bills, would the government not ask researchers to work on national priorities? Where would the researcher have the freedom to do the work that they are truly intellectually interested in? And that's the problem. The profit margins and power equations are quite well known, and I'll address this in the next slide. Journal prestige holds a sway over researchers. People think that some journals are very prestigious because of impact factors or whatever, and therefore they will publish in those journals no matter whether you negotiate fair APCs, fair open access charges or not. And this has to do with structural problems. As long as assessment within the country, appointments within the country are going to be done based on impact factors of journals where you publish your research, this problem is going to continue. This is a problem that everyone is facing. And in the process, people who suffer are the smaller journals that belong to societies. At least people of my age, have really published in places like Journal of Biological Chemistry, which was a society journal, Journal of Virology, which is again a society journal. And these are the journals which are going to suffer because of planners, because they cannot really change their business models so quickly. So what we really need is equitable and fair publishing models. This, friends, is the new colonialism. The ideas and work belong to researchers. It is funded by government or the taxpayers. The review is done by experts such as you who charge no fees to do the review, yet the copyrights and the profits all belong to the publishers. And this is not a sustainable model. I also call this the Robin Hood model because many journals have these second, third line journals. They have a whole family of journals. And if you're not able to publish in the top journal, which is free, you are asked to publish in a lesser journal for a fee. So essentially, you all know these journals. I'm not going to name those journals. You all know this. The lesser journals are subsidizing the higher journals. And this becomes a problem. Who publishes in the higher journals? It's people who have more funds to do research. It's people who work at institutions that are heavily funded. It's people who have access to all the high technology that any paper that is published today in Cell Science and Nature requires. Who suffers? Who pays? It's people who work at small institutions, at universities, mainly in the global south, who have to pay for this. So again, this is not going to be a sustainable model, and I think we should discuss this openly and come up with sustainable solutions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Shahid, for giving us this picture of, again, a sort of complicated environment with 700 universities, 7,000 research institutions. Yeah, there's been a lot of things said here about various issues. Sarita talked about or mentioned the term cognitive justice and the science of the commons. Fernando talked about the regional circuit and the need for changing evaluation cultures. And Robin sort of gave the impression that in South Africa you are sort of trying to sort of model through the the old model from the north and the circumstances given in your country. And again, in India, it's a huge task. I could understand that the preferred model still, if we are looking at India, is the green road, but there are exceptions where you're trying to use a gold model. But one thing that I often experience is that when we are talking about gold open access journals, we are only talking about journals that are charging APCs, which is a misunderstanding. But that's another discussion. Maybe we can come back to that later. So we have now, a good 20 minutes for questions to our excellent speakers here. Who will be the first one to put a question? Wow. Yeah, there's one up here. Yeah.
Yes, Vincent from Puncton Books. I had the strange feeling that this panel is somewhat lopsided. I would like to thank all the speakers, but especially the first speaker, Sarita Al-Bagli, who managed to situate, I think, the topics that we are discussing at this conference in a much wider context, which I think is extremely necessary. And so maybe my question would be is whether the other speakers could reflect on what she has been telling us and given and granted as a very necessary appeal to the current emergency in which you are living.
So
Sorry.
that was actually a question to the other speakers.
I have to ask you to speak slower, because I have a pretty good English, but I didn't understand almost half of what you said. Sorry.
To be very short, I think it would be wonderful if the last three speakers could reflect on the first talk, which I thought was very substantial and relevant.
So you encourage the three of you to address the issues or think about the issues that Sarita mentioned. Was there any specific or?
I think that there was so much in that talk that needs to be unpacked.
Yeah, you're right.
More than just numbers.
So you're free to actually relate to what Sarita said. Yeah.
Well, she talked about local knowledge and local solutions. And she gave examples of climate and vaccine denial, women's health, the drug problem, Zika virus, many of those. If there is going to be this sort of an imbalance in access to information to local problems, let's say if a Brazilian researcher who works on the local problem of Zika virus is able to publish a paper, a very good paper, in a journal, and then has to pay a lot of money to access other articles on Zika virus in the same journal, that's unfair. So, you know, at one end you're saying that, you know, these today pathogens have become global, today climate change has become global, but if you're not giving people the chance to provide local solutions to those problems, because there is limit to knowledge access, then it's clearly a problem. So that would be my take home from what you said.
Yeah, Robin?
I mean, one of the other things that struck me, particularly in relation to the first presentation, and also the discussion of the large number of journals in South America that are not indexed, relates to language. I mean, I think that one of the specific advantages that both India and South Africa have, partly as a result of a colonial heritage, is the use of English. And I think that in other parts of the world, the understanding of scientific knowledge and the transmission of knowledge, in a sense, how to establish some kind of citizen science, is based on the issue of language. And the language in which you actually transmit the ideas and the research results. And I think that aspect of it has been underexplored, and that was one of the key issues that I think came out of the talks for me.
So, Robin, I guess we were colonized by the right people and they were colonized by the wrong people.
Yeah?
I was going to say something in the same line, because a few things that I didn't say, just to respect the time, was that the resilience of the local circuits, I call local circuits to this 4,500 journals, active journals that are not indexed but respond to local needs, has to do with, of course, language, but especially with Latin American identity, because on this long-term history I try to show, I think that one of the most interesting things is that for 200 years we have had an internal regional communication that has to do with an intellectual space that is very dynamical, very strong, and it is because we have also, of course it's heterogeneous, but we also have a regional identity that is normally fed decade after decade. I was going to compare in my presentation, but I didn't get on that because of time, with the European space. Because I think it's like an inverted, you say, mirror. I mean, the European space is a very strong has gained a very strong economic integration, even political integration. But as a cultural space, I see it as very weak. As an intellectual space, I mean, going behind the cultural identities and frontiers and language frontiers. Instead, in our case, our intellectual space is very strong, and we have gained a lot of continuity and cultural integration and intellectual integration, and we have an intellectual space that is really regional, but we have never acquired the economic integration and the political integration we had for almost 10 years, very recently, was ephemeral. So it's like an inverted mirror for me.
So Rita, yeah?
I think in a certain way the other panelists addressed some of the topics that I mentioned. I would like just to comment this idea of local and global knowledge. I think there's one point that I tried to reinforce is that it's not that the so-called global southern has a local knowledge and the Western science has a global knowledge. Every knowledge has a territorial socioeconomic perspective, and in the so-called Western science also. The thing is that we now face some global issues, and each of these local views should and could act intertwined together, considering the different possibilities of solutions and perspectives that could be considering to address these very global problems. And of course, we have some infrastructures that are very traditional in terms of scientific communications. And one thing that perhaps this forum could consider is that the crisis of the scientific journals itself as the main and almost the sole infrastructure for science communications. There are an ecosystem nowadays of possibilities that could be considered, and not only this very traditional way of communicating science. So I think we could a bit open the discussion, the debate, to consider other possibilities and other alternatives that are being possible nowadays, mainly with this digital infrastructure.
Yeah. Next question. Yeah, please.
So I'm Rupert Gatty from Open Book Publishers, and could I just follow on from that and thinking about the global plus?
Slow.
Comparing the global plus idea with the global minus idea, and the role that open access can play in the global plus. A lot of the discussion that we've had has been using the traditional Western definitions of scholarship. However, we've seen that the Cielo model in 2 countries anyway has been very powerful in making open access content available. I was wondering if there was any evidence and to what degree there has been the transition of knowledge back to the Western scientific community, and whether there's any evidence of that global plus coming back. You know, is there any good news? and if there isn't, or if that has been been poorly received, what should the Western, Northern, whatever, community be doing to better connect in their own scholarly communications channels?
Any one of you giving a shot at this one?
I think you should maybe explain your concern better. But what you're saying is that if we agree all with this sort of coloniality of knowledge that Sarita has explained, I didn't want to get into the debate because we are colleagues from the same region. I really think that there is a big difference between coloniality, as a coloniality, what in Latin America we call coloniality of power, which resembles the colonial relations we still have in society. And there is a difference with coloniality of knowledge. I really don't believe in coloniality of knowledge. And that's why I said that I think that we have developed science. And quoting Sarita, I think that these local circuits or local journals are and can also be universal. It doesn't mean that if you're analyzing a local agenda, you're not offering a universal contribution. But I also think that the coloniality of knowledge is a way of seeing the periphery, but from the north. I mean, seen from the periphery, I find very dynamical knowledge developed in our scientific fields. And I think that we have many types of knowledges that are circulating that cannot work without a context or a reference. I mean, if I read European theory, I am not copying anything. I mean, imitation in intellectual creation to me is not possible. So it is a long debate, but I just wanted to give you my position.
Yeah. Next one here. Would you comment as well?
Yeah,
sure.
If I understood you, a word about if you are going back or ahead in terms of globalization minus or globalization plus. And I think as I mentioned, there is reactions and counter-reactions in terms of the open access and open science movement. At the moment, some very strong actors, political and economic actors, trying to appropriate some of the flags, some of the objectives of this movement that was promoted from the free and open source movements and against the privatization of knowledge and so on. And of course, we live in a certain economic and political structure where some there are very strong interests that are trying to maintain and even to enlarge their profits and their gains in this new scenario. So the problem is that mainly in Latin America, we have a very strong movement consolidated, as Fernanda showed, on open access. And what we are seeing at the moment is that perhaps we are move back and not ahead in terms of our agenda. This is a very, very strong challenge, including considering the political context we are living nowadays. You, of course, know what is happening in Brazil, for instance, is drama. So how to maintain these ecologies of open access and open science when you have re-emerging censorship, cut of controlling even the media? How we can talk about open knowledge, open science in this kind of situation? And this is not only in Brazil. This is something that you are observing that is occurring in many different places. So it's a long, long debate, but this is a social, political struggle, and we have to be conscious about this.
Thank you. Yeah.
Katrina McCallum, Hindawi. So just speaking to that point, one of the challenges facing Plan S in some ways, I'm fully supportive of it as a catalyst, is that if we changed the entire system to one that is open access, we would still have the same cultural system that didn't incentivize the sort of sharing and inclusivity that you're all talking about. And you're speaking now at the moment to an audience that are largely made up of publishers. Some of them are society publishers. What is it that we could be doing to make that knowledge system and knowledge environment more equitable and genuinely equitable? And I think one of the things coming from the global north is that everything that comes out of my mouth sounds like the global north and western, but what does it actually mean to a publishing or scholarly communication system to be equitable? Can anyone from the panel address that?
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, because I was very aware that I was speaking to an audience of publishers, and I myself am not a publisher, and so I had been thinking on how to make a dialogue with this and listening to the first panel. But I think there are like two main issues here. The person before in the panel said that we had three actors, I think: the publishers, the researchers, and the institutions. I heard in the first panel they said. And so I think that one of the most important conversations now, which is Plan S, you, the publishers, are the main actors in that discussion. I think that in that realm, it is very important that this conversation should be really international, which is, if we in Latin America have an open access system that's working since the beginning of the 90s, I think that the conversation should learn from that experience a bit, should get a sense of how it worked, how it was created, how it is today. And so that's one of the equity type of proposals I would make to really make a conversation including the experiences, not only of Latin America, of course, but of the South in general. And the other issue to me is especially the fees, the author contributions that the other colleagues here have addressed. I think that is for us the main problem, the main economic problem, or the main problem of science keeping to be a business, right? So I think Guédon says access is access. That was his phrase, right? Jean-Claude Guédon. And I think that in Latin America we have been working on that general idea of access is access, but our own researchers are paying to publish. And so if Plan S is this, and that's the experience that the colleagues have addressed recently. So I think that is one of the main issues to address if we want global science really, because at least until now it's not global science, it's only North science or peripheral science. I would like to agree, and this would be very long here, that our is not peripheral. I mean, the peripheral or the periphery is an invention of the mainstream, and I would like to get out of that binomial thing. But the truth is that our science is not really visible because our regional circuit has not the impact in tenure and promotion, and we are going to, I hope we're going to change that. And to the other colleague, I would say, well, the good news is that we are doing something in Latin America, and we are going to change our evaluation recommendations, because the good thing of Plan S is that for our governments and our institutions, open access is now in the top of the agenda, for governments, I mean. And this is an opportunity for us. I don't know if I'm clear on this, but I think that is a great opportunity for Latin America, at least. I don't know in Africa or in Asia. And I think we're going to take advantage of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. We have time for... Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, Robert, you will have the last comment or question. Yeah.
Thank you. So Robert Kiley from the Wellcome Trust and also Coalition S. So it was great to hear that positive endorsement for Plan S at the end. Can I just go back to something Jameel said about Plan S? And I think it probably illustrates we need to do a lot more, because the model you presented isn't Plan S. It isn't just about author pays model. We heard from Colleen earlier about trying to move subscription income. But so we can talk about that offline. But the question I want to ask you, one of the things you said, one of the real challenges was that small society publishers cannot transition. Why? Why is that the case when there's clear evidence that they can transition? In fact, we Wellcome Trust have just published a study in partnership with our friends in UKRI, which talks about different models which learning societies can explore to try and transition. So I just wonder, is that, we could throw our hands up and say it's too difficult, but why do you think learning societies can't transition?
Was it to you, Philip?
Well, as I said in my talk, one real challenge for Plan S is that it's a model that simply transfers the payment from the researcher to the funding agency, to the funder. As an idea, it's good, because then the researcher doesn't have to really scrape the barrel for coming up with money to publish open access, and there would be better compliance. But if you looked at the figures that I projected just for my country, for India, the bill is going to be enormous. So there has to be some sustainable model. And perhaps we could look at something that Wellcome Open Research does, or EuroPMC does. The fee that we pay them depends upon the funding that we provide annually. So if Plan S was calibrated according to the money that a national, the R&D budget of a country, then it's probably a far more equitable model than just having a blanket rate all the way from Guatemala to United States. So that's my take on it.
Okay, the final comment is from, or question is from Plan S as well.
Can I just make a comment about Plan S in relation to...
Yeah, sure do that.
I mean, there's a second difficulty, and that is that you're dependent on the funding sources from government. And the government's idea is open access is wonderful because you don't have to pay subscriptions anymore. So we don't have to fund that. And the effect of that would mean that it becomes even less affordable than in the Indian case. So there are a set of quite nuanced discussions that have to go on about the way in which the costs of the new funding model or the new publishing model would actually be negotiated at a local level, and it's not simple and straightforward.
Johan?
Yes,
please.
My name is Johan Roek. I'm speaking on behalf of Plan S. I really would like to discuss this more in detail with you. I mean, last week I was in Mexico to speak with people of Red Alic, and I learned a lot about open.
Please, can you speak slower?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll repeat. So
You have to speak louder somehow.
Yeah.
Or shout, or whatever.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a matter of distance of the mic. Okay, last week I was in Mexico, in Toluca, to speak with the people of Red Alec and America. I was there, yes. And I learned a lot about publishing in South America, and I was actually very impressed. I think what we should do is really have a dialogue about this. I think the suggestion that you made, that to adapt contributions to open access as a function of R&D income or as a function of some other calculation is actually a very good one, and one that we should talk about all together. I mean, publishers, funders, from different countries, and try to see how we can come up with a more equitable model. I think it's very important to keep this dialogue going, because Plan S is not just about north-south. We should really make this a global effort and really realize that we're all in this together. Publishers, funders, researchers, libraries. So on this collaborative note, I would like to end the discussion.
Yeah, okay.
I would just like to say that because of time, I didn't expand on the Amelica initiative. I couldn't be in Toluca because I was coming here. So I'm very glad to hear to what you're saying, and thanks to the colleague to let me say that I think that this global dialogue really has to do with dialogue between Plan S and Latin America. Thank you.
Okay, one final comment from my part. I think what we have seen here today, if we are discussing sort of more specific thing, is that we have representatives from Latin America who have invented open access actually earlier, because governments and institutions are actually funding the dissemination of research as well. And we have seen South Africa who are trying to, via accreditation of journals, trying to improve sort of the level. And this means that we have thousands of journals that are operating on a non-APC basis so far. Things are changing. And I think that was maybe a thing for India to consider, to actually invest in making journals published in India good publication channels, and then have the government say, okay, we will reward the researchers who are doing that. Then you don't have to discuss that much about APCs if all the issues of prestige and impact would diminish. This is a discussion that might continue during the drinks reception, which will start now. But before you leave, please join me in the applause for the speakers here.